In that case, let me just say good evening and welcome. I'm Claire Winchester. I work in the Information and Engagement team here at the MS Trust. And I'd like to welcome you all to our webinar on MS and working life. I want to thank you for joining us at what might have been the end of your own working day. Now, before we get started, we've got some housekeeping items I need to mention. So just to make it clear, for the whole of this webinar, the audience cannot be seen by each other or by the speaker in order to protect your privacy. I hope you can all see and hear me okay, and if you're having any technical issues, please put a comment in the chat box at the bottom of the screen and our technical team will try and help you. Any comment you put in there will only be visible to the production team and not to other people in the audience or to the speakers. Now, for the speakers, if you've got questions for them, we've got moderators standing by to collect those questions, and you type those in the Q&A box at the bottom. Now, they'll disappear as they wing their way to us, so you don't need to type in questions more than once. Now, we don't think there's any content in this webinar that would be harmful to children, but it is, intended for an adult audience, and you would have had to have confirmed that you're over 18 and booked. If you're not familiar with the work of the MS Trust, let me just start by introducing ourselves. Our strapline is that the MS Trust is here for everyone affected by MS, from the point of diagnosis and throughout your journey. You might well be familiar with our books, our website, our online tools, or maybe our podcast, our YouTube channels, or social media. And we're here to empower people affected by MS to make informed decisions about their lives through the provision of reliable and trustworthy information. And since 2000, we've also provided the training for every new MS nurse, and we work to place more MS nurses and advanced MS champions into the areas of the UK with the greatest need. And we're also listening to people with MS and working collaboratively with other MS organisations and with the NHS in order to represent the views of people living with MS. Now, today we're talking about the working world, and we're hoping to provide you with some thoughtful information and some practical tips on managing your working life with MS. We know that many studies have shown that people with MS tend to leave work earlier than they might have planned, and many people face difficult choices about disclosing MS to employers, deciding whether to reduce their hours or change their roles. But we know that the right information and support can really make a difference, and that's where our speakers come in. We are very pleased to be joined by three exceptional speakers, all with different expertise in this area. Gideon Schulman lives and works with MS himself and has additional really valuable insight from the HR perspective in his long-standing career and also in his role as CEO of the professional services company, the Davka Group. Gideon is a former international HR director and a fellow of the CIPD, which is the HR professional body. Joanne Hurford is a clinical specialist occupational therapist, which is quite a mouthful. She leads the vocational rehabilitation unit at the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery in London, where she works to enhance people's ability to stay in work and recognise how to make career transitions at the right time. And then Lance Baynham will be speaking, and he's a discrimination caseworker on behalf of South West London Law Centres. And he's going to be looking at the details of disability law as it relates to people with MS who might be unsure of their rights. Now, the format for the webinar today, each of our speakers will talk to you for around 10 to 12 minutes, and then there'll be time for your questions to the panel at the end. We anticipate the whole session to last between 45 minutes to an hour, depending on the number of questions. So let me first welcome Gideon Schulman to speak. Gideon has kindly agreed to let me interview him about his working life with MS. And I think he's just going to turn on his camera. There you are. Welcome, Gideon. Thank you for joining us. So perhaps you could start by telling us a little bit about your diagnosis and how you discovered that you had MS.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's always difficult to sort of know what symptoms, really, start you off with, start off the path of MS. And I know there's a lot of research going on at the moment about the EBV virus, but I think my symptoms probably dated back to somewhere around, my A levels, and they sort of continued up through university. And I think the main symptoms I had there was sort of, there's some fatigue, the pins and needles, balance issues. It wasn't actually until the end of my studies when I sort of developed optic neuritis that I was given a formal diagnosis. And I think a lot, and most people I ever talk to, they can always remember that day, however far back it was, of when you're given that diagnosis. And I can turn around and sort of say, it was September 2001, and it was Dr. Helen Ford in Leeds, and I remember sitting in that room. So even though it was 21 years ago, I can still visualize that time I was given the diagnosis. And I think really, for the sort of following 10 years, I had that relapsing remitting MS, and then it became progressive, and it was, from there, I've had to sort of live with that progressive MS. And in 2017, I actually went to Mexico for HSCT, and actually that sort of stopped the progression, which I'm very lucky for. And now, after sort of several consultants, I'm lucky enough to be, under Professor Giovanni. But I think that my path has been sort of quite clear along the sort of that medical route.
So you've actually had a knowledge of MS for pretty much the whole of your working life, having had the diagnosis really quite early on in your career. Has that been something that you've had to bring up with successive employers then?
Yeah, I think, I suppose I'm in that semi-unique position in the respect that I'm slightly different because I'm an HR professional, because at university, and sort of in my, my postgraduate studies, it was around HR. So I was always very aware of my rights, and I'm not going to sort of get into the realms of, I know Lance is going to talk about the technicalities later, but I was aware that ultimately, you weren't under any obligation to disclose your MS, but at the same time, if you were asked, you can't lie about it. And I think, understanding, do you want to disclose that? Where do you want to be? And I think, I was always aware that ultimately, unless it's a health and safety risk, there is no obligation to disclose that. And so I didn't disclose my MS until it really did start to affect my work. And I knew that was a high risk strategy, because once you've already started work, you're then changing the relationship as soon as you're turning around and saying, well, one day you're this, next day, oh, by the way, I need to tell you all about this. And there's the risk that your manager is going to feel ambushed by that, giving such quite significant news that's going to impact them, your team, the organization, yourself.
So how did you actually approach the subject of disclosure when it came to that point? As you say, there's a lot to take into account there, isn't there?
Well, that's right. And I suppose for me, I couldn't go to HR. I think, that place you go to, in theory, you go for advice. I couldn't really go to HR. So I sort of had to look around the organization of, looking for a senior manager who I knew I could sit and discuss, the sort of disclosure with. And he was great. He was, he was very, very practical. And he said, look, don't bombard your manager. Any communication you give, it's that classic, KISS. Keep it simple, keep it basic. The chances are 70-30, they wouldn't have a clue about MS. And if you start going in with all the technicalities, they're just really going to feel ambushed. And so just keep it very high level. Explain that you've got a disability, explain how it affects you, and tell them what you need. And he said, bullet point it if you need to, but, don't bombard them with information. Just keep it that simple. And then you can always have a follow-up meeting with them to discuss it in more detail. And so I sort of took that advice, and I went to speak to my manager, and they weren't really, because they didn't understand MS, and they were very open about it, but they weren't really interested to a certain extent, because they had their own targets, their own work to do, their own teams to manage. And for me, they sort of passed me off to occupational health. So I then got referred to an occupational health advisor, who ultimately wasn't, that much help. And it was catch-22. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know what to advise. And actually that meant that I could steer that report into the way that would help me. So it was that catch-22 of, they didn't know anything, so I could manage that. But that my manager, obviously being from HR, wanted to comply with everything, but didn't know. And I think the key lesson that I took away from it was, I had to own it. I had to lead. I had to lead on how my health is managed in relation to work, and not rely on others. And I think that's a key part about owning it and leading on it. Because not that managers were bad people, but it's not, my health isn't their priority.
Sure. What kind of supports have you received from employers? I mean, have they helped to make any adjustments to your role in now or earlier on in your career?
Yeah, I think I was very lucky that it's I have to I'm sure it'll be mentioned later, but one of the greatest resources was being referred to Access to Work, which is a publicly funded employment program where they fund you so you can have practical and financial support. And on through that, I'm working with my employer. I was given I was assessed, and I was given a better desk and a chair. I was even given an iPad that I can, being an Apple fan, I can show off about, and a dictaphone, and all the voice to text software, and training on how to use it best, and even funding towards taxes, which was great. And they worked with my employer to have that report done and then put that in place. And so from my employer's perspective, they were just happy to follow along that guidance. And in that respect, it was very good. And I suppose some of the better things, because I worked as an international sort of HR director and I was suffering with fatigue, they arranged it so I could fly out to meetings early and I could stay a bit longer so I could manage that. And they did occasionally upgrade me to make life a bit easier. So going to Australia first class was very nice. So
oh my goodness, yes. Yeah. Have there been any symptoms or aspects of MS that you found more difficult to discuss with your employers?
Yeah, I think that the ones that you're more always uncomfortable about is that sort of bladder urgency. You don't really want to go to the person you've had quite a not a cold relationship, but a more dry relationship, and say you've got bladder problems. And I think the occupational health report was actually a good way to encourage them to say, can you can the desk be closer to the bathroom? And but and so that was good. I think one of the most difficult ones to explain was fatigue, because even people with MS don't understand fatigue, and trying to explain that. So trying to explain something you don't understand is very difficult. And then I suppose that the other thing was my dexterity, my difficulty in writing. And I think as someone who works in HR, who spends all day interviewing disciplinaries and grievances, not that anybody should ever have a disciplinary, but you don't want to start recording those sessions. You get into awkward positions, and then we had to find a note taker. The problem with the note taker is your employer then had to spend more money on getting somebody else. So I sort of did the usual thing of finding somebody more junior and saying, oh, it's a development opportunity to come along and take notes and learn about sort of disciplinaries. So it's you need to sort of play the system in that respect. So it's
so I mean, clearly your background as an HR professional has played a part in your approach to speaking to employers and things. Do you have any tips for employers, though, who discover that they've got an employee with MS, what they should be thinking about?
Yeah, I think from an employer perspective, I think it's about working with the individual. As I said before, you need to own it, and I think as an employer, you need to empower that individual to lead on it. And I think especially, I know I'm teaching people how to suck eggs, but MS is different in each person. So even as an employer, if you've got a relative who's got MS, it's like knowing that that's not necessarily the same ways it affects that individual. And I think it's about being there and supportive for that individual, and really making that space so that they can come to you, or they can use the resources, and they can use organizations like the MS Trust to support them, because chances are they're learning, they're trying to find their way around, and so try not to put too much pressure on your employees, because they need they're on a journey as well, I think.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your openness there, Gideon. There's some really useful insights. So if our audience have any questions for Gideon, either in his in his professional capacity or in his capacity as just somebody with a lot of experience of living with MS, do please type them into the Q&A box at the bottom. Our production team will sort them all out and send them on to me to ask on your behalf. And we'll come to that at the end of the session. Thank you so much, Gideon.
Not a problem.
That's brilliant. That brings me to our next speaker, occupational therapist Joanne Hurford, who's going to talk about her work in vocational rehabilitation. I'm not needed for this bit, so if I can find Jo and Jo's slides, there we go. Good evening, Jo. I'm going to hand over to you to take it from here.
Thank you very much, Claire. Good evening, everyone. So, as I said, I am an occupational therapist, and I am very lucky to work in a vocational rehab team that comprises of psychologists, some occupational therapists, and a consultant neurologist. And so that's the context. And our service here was actually set up on the back of some research study for people that had multiple sclerosis. So it's been a big core part of our work that we do here. Next slide, please. So it doesn't always feel like work can be good, but we do know there's lots of benefits of work, and they provide physical structure, identity and role, social networks, a meaning concept of leisure and work, a sense of purpose and financial independence, skills, social status, and activity. But it's, next slide, please. It is about the quality of the job that matters. And we know that good work is good for our health, and it can be associated with less use of NHS services. It's also associated with longer kind of life longevity, and people in work have less problems with mental health problems. But equally, if it's poor work, then and it's difficult to work in maintaining that environment, it can also have a huge impact on you. So the Taylor Review in 2016 suggested that there were key areas that considered to be good work, and that was fair pay and job security, having good working conditions, which includes a sense of autonomy, opportunities to work for a variety in a varied way and to be creative, to have support in periods of intense pressure, and to feel safe in that environment. That's emotionally safe and physically safe. Good work should also provide an opportunity for a work-life balance, and there's reasonable reward for the efforts that you put in. And good work should also, identified, include training so that you have the opportunities to progress in your job. Next slide, please. So we know that people with MS are primarily diagnosed in their 20s to 40s, which is the prime of your career, which is why it's really important for us to be kind of recognising this and supporting this. Next slide, please. And this is about saying it's not about the symptoms that the individual experiences. It's not about the severity of the symptoms that impacts on work per se. It's about how those symptoms impact on that job that person has. So, for example, if you were a scaffolder and had mild balance difficulties and fatigue, it would be very difficult to kind of work in this job safely, and it would be quite difficult to put some adjustments in place. Whereas if you're an office worker, balance difficulties would be able to be adjusted so much easier for. Next slide, please. So my colleague Jo Sweetland did her PhD, and she found that what people with MS need to remain, or would like to remain to work, is support for early intervention at diagnosis. So this includes kind of knowing about their rights in the workplace, thinking about disclosure, and having support in place to communicate with the employers. It's about supporting to manage performance. It's not about supporting to manage the impairments per se. It's about light touch and specific problems rather than lifelong counselling about the problems. And we certainly model that in our service, where people come in and come out. It's about having support to liaise with the employers to make adjustments. And I think that for us, we experience lots of the patients that we work with have invisible symptoms, so it can be quite difficult to explain, or I think the employers find it quite helpful when there's a medical profession that comes in and kind of helps to support that really and validate those difficulties. And also there's a role for education and support of employers. Obviously fatigue is very different to everyday tiredness that people experience. If you don't have MS, and it's about educating employers that is a difference. So next slide, please. So I just wanted to bring up this slide really, that of the pathways of support that we provide. So in the early stages, similar to Joe, it's about providing advice around disclosure and whether or not it's the right time to disclose, thinking about people's legal rights in the workplace. And it might be really light touch or just 1 or 2 sessions, just kind of back the ball, meet us and know what we're able to offer, and then people come back when they're ready. There might be then a change in someone's level of function, and that might be when we're looking at someone's work adjustments and thinking about how they're doing things. Also, like, people may be out of work for periods of time if you have a relapse, and so then the job here is about thinking about work readiness and supporting a return to work, which is a different piece of work. And then as time goes on and disability might accumulate over time, then it's about having conversations about the work exit and supporting a good work exit. So I'll just go through those a little bit more now. Next slide, please. And so Lance is going to talk about disclosure and the legal aspects, but what I wanted to say here is that the evidence base suggests that early disclosure is helpful, and having reasonable adjustments will help someone to stay in employment for longer. However, like, from practical experience, we do know that each person, each work environment and each work culture is very different. So this is a very personal decision for you to be making if you don't fit into one of the categories where you have to disclose. And for example, some people may decide to just disclose in one job and may not have a positive experience about it and choose not to disclose in the next employment, or vice versa. So it might change throughout someone's working career whether they choose to disclose or not. As clinicians, we encourage people to think about the pros and cons, the work culture, who, when and what you're going to disclose. And it can be difficult to say it out loud sometimes to employer if it's the early stages of a diagnosis, and it might be helpful to work through a script and to think about framing it in a positive light, and thinking about offering solutions where the problems exist. And again, having that documented. So next slide, please. Just wanted to say here really is that the Equality Act is what helps underpin our work and helps to support our requests for changes in the workplace. And when thinking about reasonable adjustments as clinicians, we're thinking about breaking down the barriers that might cause someone to be feel disadvantaged. And I think this picture here of like the boxes of treating everyone the same doesn't necessarily work, and that's why there do need to be differences. So, you know, if you are given 2 boxes to be able to see over the barrier, then that can make a huge difference to somebody. Next slide, please. Again, I understand Lance is going to be talking through this. So there's no one list of what's reasonable or what's reasonable, and it needs to be taken into consideration about the disability, the size of the employer, and whether the suggestions are practical or not. But I see this as an opportunity to be really creative, and I think it's really important to try, when you're looking at reasonable adjustments, really think about your symptoms that you might experience, the work environment and the job demands, and this for us is what leads us to thinking about the list of adjustments that would be helpful. And certainly over the last few years, when there's been more introductions of like disease modifying drugs and infusions and stuff like that, we've certainly been using the adjustments like the disability leave to have planned time off for treatment, or maybe adjustments to sickness trigger points. And so, yeah, they've been really helpful. And I think Lance is going to speak about the rest. So next slide, please. So as I said, that's when we're kind of thinking about adjustments. If someone's had a period of time out of work because of an MS relapse, and perhaps there's been a change in someone's level of function, then it's really important to think about the readiness for return to work. And again, this is quite individual, because it's about finances, it's thinking about your symptoms and thinking about the employer's work expectations. But a graded return to work should be individualized to the person. It should look at a graded return to work of your hours and your duties. Next slide, please. And then just to say that, I'm sorry, this is a whistle-stop tour, but people, when it comes to kind of work exit, people do leave work for a number of reasons. And this is the literature here, and people might leave work because of physical, cognitive or emotional problems. It might be about employers or family members' attitudes and beliefs. It might even be a change of employer or a change in your job role, which makes a huge difference to you. It might be a lack of flexibility from the employers, or maybe you've just been like some ambience and negative feelings about work on your part, or there's been a huge change in life goals and priorities, and perhaps acceptance of the condition and wanting to manage it differently. So people come out of work for lots of different reasons. And as therapists, we try to support around deciding the right time to leave, thinking about whether it's helpful to reduce your hours or leave work, and that thinking about what benefits you might be able to access, or your pension systems, or it might be about changing to a less demanding role if staying in work is really important and there's support there for you for redeployment. There's support to access ill health retirement if that's available, benefits, and then to consider your work, your plans after work in terms of like that beginning slide that we talked about, the structure, the time, the sense of importance, the sense of autonomy, the sense of achievement. How are you going to keep that in your work if you in your life if work becomes it's no longer a part of it? So last slide, please. Sorry, that's the one that I've just talked through. Sorry, last slide. Thank you. So here, really, just want to say that the people I know that work with MS really are very hard workers, and there can be a tendency where life becomes, absolutely engrossed with work, and things like our self-care and our leisure kind of slip away and work takes priority. And I think this is really important when you are working to try and look after yourself. And try to keep these other things in balance if you can. So I am going to finish it there and invite people for questions either now or later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jo. That was really interesting. And I think it's really good to see the difference that the right support can make to somebody who is facing, tricky decisions at work. So we'll hold off on questions until the very end. I can see there's quite a few coming through already. Thank you so much. Pop them into the Q&A box at the bottom as you go, and we'll pull them out in a little while. But I'm going to call on Lance next to talk us through some of the issues in disability law as they pertain to people with MS. So welcome, Lance, and away you go.
Thanks very much, Claire. Yes, my name's Lance Baynham. I'm the discrimination caseworker at South West London Law Centres. And in this talk, I pick up on some of the themes that have come up already. But going to talk briefly to the following points. So look, first of all, at what a disability is for the purpose of disability discrimination under the Equality Act. Then I'm going to look at two specific types of, or two specific provisions that apply just to the protected characteristic of disability, which are reasonable adjustments and something called discrimination arising from disability. Then I'm going to talk a bit about disclosing your MS and conversations with your employer before looking at some further guidance and signposting. So next slide, please. So this slide, I can go through very quickly. For most health conditions, whether they amount to a disability or not depends on whether they meet this test in the Equality Act, which is whether it's a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term adverse effect on your ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. So that's the test that normally applies, but there are a few conditions, MS being one of them, that are set out in the legislation as always being deemed to be a disability. So if you have MS, then you don't need to demonstrate, the severity of its effects on you. You don't have to meet this test in the legislation. If you have MS, there's no question that the protections I'm about to go through apply to you. Next slide, please. So the first specific protection in the Equality Act for people with disabilities that I wanted to go through is the duty that an employer has to make reasonable adjustments. So I've set this out in kind of in full on the slide. What this is about is the fact that your employer is under a duty to adjust its policies, its practices, its requirements to avoid the difficulties that a disabled person faces. So let's say your employer's requirement is that you work pretty continuously from when you turn up until when you leave. That is the requirement that they expect of everyone. That's difficult for you because, let's say, one of the consequences of your MS is that you experience fatigue, and so you can't work continuously in the way that your employer wants you to. Then a reasonable adjustment might be that you're provided with rest breaks, at regular intervals. Joe mentioned this as well, but there are potentially unlimited number of adjustments that could be made. Some common ones do include things like rest breaks, time off for medical appointments, adjustments to your working hours, provision of a chair to sit on and rest, adjusted equipment or special equipment for your requirements, moving to a different role, your role being adjusted, working from home, or again, if you've had a period of absence from work, then a phased or graded return to work. But I think one of the things again that has obviously been mentioned is that MS is different for everyone. With reasonable adjustments, the only question is whether you, as the person with MS, are put at a substantial disadvantage. So it doesn't matter that someone else with MS wouldn't have this need. The question is whether your MS makes it difficult to follow a policy or requirement of your employer, and whether that particular policy or requirement should be adjusted. I've just mentioned at the bottom here a point about your employer only being under a duty if they know or ought to know about your MS. I'm going to mention that briefly now and speak about that in a bit more detail in a moment. Next slide, please. Discrimination arising from disability is a particular protection, relatively recent, under the Equality Act for people with disabilities. And to illustrate it, I'm just going to compare it with what's called direct discrimination. So direct discrimination is where someone is treated less well than someone else because of a protected characteristic. In this case, we're talking about the protected characteristic of disability. let's say that as a result of your MS, you have relatively high absence levels from work, relatively high health-related absence, and your employer turns around and says, "Oh, we can't tolerate this. We're going to have to let you go." Now, in that scenario, the reason for the treatment is not the fact that you're disabled. Someone without a disability, someone without MS, who had the same levels of absence, would also be dismissed. But your levels of absence are the consequence of your disability, and that's the reason for the treatment. And so if you're treated unfavorably because of one of the consequences of your MS, then that is, as a starting point, unlawful. However, your employer can justify it. So there will come a point where your level of absence, say, might be so high that in the circumstances, an employer's done everything that they can, they've thought about all the different things they can do to help, etc. There will come a point where they could justify, following a fair process, dismissing you, but they will have to justify it. They will have to show that they have followed that fair and reasonable procedure, etc. Again, I've just mentioned knowledge here as being a requirement of an employer being liable, which again, I'll just note in passing and we'll discuss in a minute. Next slide. So, disclosing your MS. Now, for both of those two types of, those two provisions of the Equality Act, I said that when it comes to reasonable adjustments, your employer only is under a duty to make reasonable adjustments if it knows or ought to know that you have the relevant disability. And in fact, they also must be the case that they know or ought to know that you're likely to be put at the substantial disadvantage. With discrimination arising from disability, again, your employer needs to know, or must be that they could reasonably have known of the disability before they could be liable. So we've spoken a little bit about the considerations to bear in mind if you're thinking about disclosing your MS. And Joe mentioned how much that's a really personal decision, and it's going to depend on a number of emotional considerations as well as practical considerations. It's also going to depend on how open you are, the level of trust you have with your employer, and so on. But I'm going to talk about some of the legal aspects and the advantages of disclosing it, particularly essentially the point that I've just made about these protections only applying if your employer knows or could know of the disability, of the fact that you've got MS. But I'm going to talk about a couple of things to bear in mind. So who, what, and when. I realise very unhelpfully that's not the order I put those questions on the slide, but sorry about that. So thinking about who you disclose or talk to, for your employer to know that you have MS, it doesn't need to be the case that everyone in the company, that the entire organisation knows. So Gideon mentioned that there was a senior manager who he did feel comfortable talking to, or there might be that you do feel comfortable talking to someone in HR. And if you talk to them about your MS, you can say, I don't want this to be spread around the office, and that is confidential to you. And your employer will still know, and they'll still be under the duties and obligations that I mentioned a moment ago. Likewise, if you just discuss it with occupational health, your employer will be treated as knowing all of that. So that's who. Now, what to disclose? Again, Gideon mentioned that it can be helpful to have a sort of ongoing conversation, that maybe to start with, it's a very keep it simple conversation, and then you have further conversations as appropriate. So I think, again, given that obviously MS can present very differently for different people, and its effects can change, it might be that you have a conversation and there are some adjustments or something that are agreed, and then your requirements change. And then it might be that you need to have a separate conversation to say, well, I now have these requirements, and have a separate conversation about that. And so I think the way that obviously you do that does depend massively. But I think if you can talk about the condition, the treatment, the impact it's having on your work, the adjustments that are required, and obviously, as Joe said, trying to do that in as positive a way as possible. Saying, this is how I'm going to be able to stay doing the job that I'm doing and doing such a great job at, then that's going to be all the better. And finally, when it might be that after your diagnosis, there aren't adjustments. I think this is something Gideon was just mentioning. There aren't adjustments that you necessarily need at that point, and you might say, I'd prefer to just not disclose this and keep going as I am for whilst I can do. But again, I think Joe also said that the earlier you can have that conversation, and often the easier it's going to be further down the line potentially. And again, I think the other point to mention is one I just made a moment ago, that obviously if your MS is progressive and your needs are changing, then it might need to be the case that you have several conversations about this. One practical point on making a note of the conversation, it might be that it's easier for you to disclose it by putting something in writing, or if you need to request an adjustment, to put it in writing, and to ask for a response in writing, so you've got that documented. It might be advisable to keep a note of any conversation you have. In that way, if there is a discussion about something being agreed, and your employer then changes its tune, you can say, well, this is what we agreed at the time. I've got an email, or I've got this note confirming that. And again, all of those conversations are private and confidential. If you have that conversation just with occupational health or just with someone in HR, then they can't go telling your colleagues without your permission. Okay, and on to the final slide, please. So a couple of other kind of sources of support to mention. Occupational health, obviously Joe's spoken about. Many companies will have their own occupational health service, or they'll use an outside agency. And occupational health can then provide some, from a health perspective, some support to advise your employer about what requirements you might need. Access to work, again, has already been mentioned. Gideon's discussed this, and I won't go into too much more detail. But again, this can be a really helpful source of funding as well for an employer to help afford things like Gideon's iPad, for example. National Career Service and Job Centre Disability Employment Advisors, I don't have much specific sort of personal professional experience with, but they're both sources that can provide some support if you're thinking about retraining or your options. So there are two further sources to explore. Ill health retirement. If you've paid into a private pension scheme, you may qualify to take that pension early for ill health reasons if you reach a point where you aren't going to be able to work anymore. But again, that's something to be considered very carefully and to explore once you've looked at other options. Finally, law centres and citizens advice bureaus, two networks that provide excellent support and free legal advice. I'm at South West London Law Centres. We provide a free 20-minute advice appointment. There's a means test, but if you qualify on that, you get some free legal advice if you do have an issue with your work. So that's all I wanted to go through. Sorry, again, it's a bit of a whistle-stop talk, but hopefully we finished in enough time for some questions, and so I'll hand back over to Claire to manage that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lance. I mean, that is a complex topic, and I think you've made it a lot clearer, certainly to me, and I hope it's been useful to some of our viewers as well. So I think if all of our panelists could put their cameras back on, while you've all been talking, we've had lots of fantastic questions through. So I'm going to read out a few for you guys to answer, if that's okay. So thank you very much, everyone who's put in a question, and thank you. If you haven't typed in a question yet, use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and you can put it in there. So, so one question here. Do any of our panelists have thoughts specifically on moving from full-time to part-time employment and how best to approach it? It's quite difficult. If someone's the questioner is saying it's becoming difficult to work full-time or compressed hours, and the role gets quite intense. The concern is, of course, that the workload will stay the same even if you're working fewer hours. So can our panelists give us some suggestions for dealing with that, perhaps?
I don't mind. I've certainly seen experiences of this where working hours have been reduced, but perhaps work duties haven't. I think it's having some really clear guidance about, or some really clear conversations about what you will do and what you won't be doing. And I think you also want to be thinking about if you're making the decision to leave work versus go to part-time, you want to be thinking about what your pension arrangements are, whether you're going to be on a final kind of salary pension, or if like moving to part-time will affect that. Other kind of things to take into consideration might be about, do you need to access benefits to support you working part-time? And if you do, then looking into the permitted kind of working hours and how much you can earn. So it is a very individual decision, but it's about finding out the information about what things might like have an impact. So for some people, it may be that you have medical retirement, and that might be a more preferable option than reducing and then thinking about volunteering or something like that.
Gideon, did you want to come in?
I would echo a lot of what Joanne has said in the respect that you really, if you're thinking, you really have to do your research. I recently heard a grievance hearing because a person had taken ill health retirement and didn't realise that they couldn't do any work at all, and that they actually couldn't afford to live off their ill health pension. And they wanted to do some part-time work, and they weren't allowed to under the clause, and they wanted to reverse the decision. So I would recommend that, you know, if you were thinking of leaving, you really have to do your research as to how you're going to cope and how you know how that would work. I think it's difficult when you're going down to part-time work. You know, you've got to work. All our advice is very generic, and it depends on the specific task at hand. And, you know, how is that other work going to be picked up, and what will that employer have to put in place to cover that? So I think you have to, again, it's about having those clear lines of communication, that very honest conversations as to how that would work in practice as well.
Thank you. I'm going to move quite quickly through these so we get plenty of time. So one of the positives actually of the last few years is, of course, that remote working has become a more popular and available option for people. So would you recommend that for somebody who has mobility issues and with people having trouble getting around? Go ahead, Jo.
So I think it's quite individual, because certainly remote working has been a lifeline to lots of people, and it's really helped them to manage their fatigue and be home earlier, manage their diet in a better way. So it's been really positive for some people. But I'm also aware that there are several people that I work with that are out now actually requesting to go back into the workplace. And sometimes if you work on your own or you live on your own, being isolated might not be the thing that is helping you. And certainly a lady just this week has decided to go back to work because she'll do more steps getting to work in and around the workplace and stuff like that. So for some people, they're choosing to go back to work because that's where they'll get the most mobility. But I think at least having a split and a varied week with part working from home and part remote working, I think is quite a healthy way to work these days.
I was just going to make one very quick follow-up point as well, that if you are working from home, it's not the case that your employer's kind of health and safety obligations suddenly cease. They say, oh, you're at home now, and so you're kind of responsible for your own health and safety at work. Those obligations and duties are continuing. So so that still will be part of an ongoing kind of conversation about what they're doing to make sure to guarantee your health and safety.
So they could still be providing you with screens or desks or equipment to keep you working safely in your own home as well. Absolutely. Now, of course, not every work is something that can be done remotely. We've had some questions from people who have quite physical jobs, and managing MS fatigue with quite a physical job means just sort of walking away. And you know, I think our questioner is really quite concerned that they've got a very all or nothing situation there. What kind of advice might you suggest here? It is a tricky one, isn't it, Gideon?
I think again it's about having those open and honest conversations about what options are available, and you know, ultimately there might not be another option, but there might be ones that surprise you. You know, it's and having those conversations, you know, will bring that to the floor. But you know, sometimes you just can't. You know, there isn't an option. There isn't a solution. You know, you have to accept that. But as I say, there might be things you never thought about.
Yeah, sorry. So I just that I was just going to echo what Gideon said, and also that there are you know, a reasonable adjustment can stretch quite far, and that an adjustment might mean moving to a completely new job in the same employer, or you know, your duties being quite radically adjusted. And it might be that that's obviously there's a question of what is reasonable, but in principle, all of those things could be adjustments to be agreed. So if you have an employer saying, "Oh, you can't carry on doing this," you know, then there's going to be some further exploration that needs to be done to see if there is anything that actually might assist.
There have been quite a few questions about the Access to Work scheme, and we've all alluded to it a little bit. And it's one of those things that I think deserves to be much better explored. In terms of Access to Work providing funding for adjustments and for your employer to offer to you, but also in terms of other similar things where they might offer retraining or support for people to change careers as a result of disability.
I'll let Jo go. Go on. Jo seemed quite enthusiastic then, so it's.
Well, I'm not sure I can answer the question about the retraining, and perhaps you can help me there. I mean, I am aware that Access to Work are quite diverse. They obviously cover the support with travel to and from workplace. They can provide funding for equipment in the workplace. And they can also provide support workers, which is an excellent resource as well. And something that I've been using more recently is they can provide emotional support through the Remploy scheme. And other parts is about providing support for interviews, but I'm not entirely sure that they can provide support for retraining jobs. They can certainly provide in-house education. I've certainly used that for people with like traumatic brain injuries, where Access to Work have come in and done some education sessions to upskill the employees about supporting the condition and supporting like strategies in the workplace. So perhaps Gideon can help us with the retraining part.
I'm not 100% sure. I learned that Access to Work isn't applicable to all jobs. I learned a few years ago that if you worked in the civil service, you couldn't get Access to Work.
How about self-employed people, by the way, Gideon? That was another question we had.
Yeah, as far as I know, even if you're self-employed, you can still get funding. It's a matter of, you know, you apply through your local authority, you fill in the forms, and they do ultimately they do a financial assessment of what your employer can afford against what they should fund. As far as I know from memory, if you're self-employed, you can actually claim access to work because they've got that specialist knowledge. So yeah, I believe you can. Yes.
Yeah. So just to reiterate what Gideon's saying there about access to work, they look at the size of your employers. So if it's a huge company, they may be requesting that, they may be requesting that they contribute a percentage of money towards what it is that's been agreed, whether it be equipment or well, actually, I think it's equipment. But if you're self-employed, then generally, because you're a small employer, they have, I think there's some wording on their document, on their spreadsheet, that they will give you like towards 100% of that, unless it's something like a stair lift at home, and some of it, sometimes that might be part personal, part work use, and then there'll be a decision around like, how much will be contributed towards that as well. But they're a fantastic scheme, and it is national. So if you look it up on www.gov.access-to-work, then all the information's there.
Absolutely, and we'll put that link in when we circulate the webinar by email as well. There's two other topics I just want to get to in our last couple of minutes. Things that people have asked a number of different questions about. One is about disability leave, which I think was alluded to in a little bit, and I think somebody would like a little more detail on that. And the other is around disclosure of MS at the interview stage. Is that something that you would recommend, or would you say get the job first and then disclose your MS?
Disclosure at interview stage is very, I think, it's been mentioned already, it's very personal decision when you do that. I've been in interviews where I have disclosed my MS, and I've watched as a senior HR director, their body language closes and you can see them cringing, and surprisingly I didn't get the job. And I'll never quite know if it was that or my personality that lost the job. And then in other cases, employers really don't care, and so they have, it doesn't stop them from taking you on. So it really is, there's no right or wrong answer. And you're
not required to disclose at any stage, are you?
No.
Unless it's
unless you're asked, you're not allowed to lie. So if you're asked in a certain way, then you're not allowed to lie. I'm sure Lance will say.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the thing is that you could, if you did lie and say, no, I haven't got MS, and then, you want to say that your employer is required to make an adjustment, or you then think you have been, say you are dismissed for your levels of absence or something, then you're not going to get a claim off the ground, really. If your employer's asked you about it and you've said, no, I don't have MS, then that's kind of the end of the road there. Just very quickly, in terms of interviews, not only are you not required to disclose, but actually it's an employer can only in very tightly prescribed circumstances ask about your health at the interview stage. So they can for sort of equal opportunities monitoring forms and things like that. But if in an interview they say you ask about your health requirements, then there's additional kind of protections there that to prevent employers doing that and then screening people on the basis of the response.
Yeah, thank you. And that last point then on disability leave, what does that mean, and how is that different to sick leave for somebody? So I think
my computer's just told me it's about to restart doing something, so I apologise. So disability leave is something that the unions have introduced, and it's about being recorded differently to sick leave. So sick leave is around, if you have a common cold or if you've had COVID or something like that. But disability leave is about receiving prescribed treatment for your condition, for your multiple sclerosis. So it might be about coming in to physiotherapy, or it might be about coming in for an infusion and stuff like that. Not every employer recognises it, and not every employer kind of support it, but we certainly encourage that it be considered if you do need to kind of have time off work or some adjustments to receive treatment. And so if where employers won't necessarily be considering disability leave, then it might be that you might want to look at the case of having your trigger points raised if there's certain specific trigger points that might kind of kickstart policies and procedures. And so you might be wanting to argue the case of, like, actually, because I have my infusions, it might make me more vulnerable to infections, and therefore you might need X amount more days. Hopefully it helps.
That certainly does. I think we could show the last slide now, perhaps. The MS Trust has several resources on the topic of working life and MS, and we've also got one in there from the MS Society, who have a very useful workplace adjustment agreement that Joanne's pointed us towards. So obviously the MS Trust webpage has an awful lot on working life with MS under the Your Finances banner, including some, it's mostly signposting to some of the places that Lance and Joanne have drawn our attention to. But we also there have a link to At Work with MS, where Mike and Letisha share some personal experiences of their own work in the workplace. We will be sending all of these links that have come up when we email this webinar to you, when you'll get your own copy of it. And when we put it up on the website as well, we will be putting we'll make sure that there's a full list of all the resources that have been mentioned today, including things like the Access to Work and other schemes that might be useful. So don't worry if you don't have time to note them all down. We'll include all those links. It really only remains for me to thank our brilliant speakers for giving up their time this evening. It's such an important topic for people living with MS, and I hope that our viewers will be taking away some new insight or knowledge that will help in their own lives. So very big thank you, and good night to everybody.
Thank you.